the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 69.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R2 Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. Today, we bring back on Markham Hislop for his monthly segment, and we call it Markham on Energy. And why is that? Because that's what his segment is called at theAmericanEnergyNews.com, where you can find all of Markham's work and really enjoy discussing all things energy. But usually we go Canada or Canada-US today. We talk about Canada and what's going on in the oil sands. And so without further ado, here is Markham Hislop. Well, Markham, it's been a few weeks since we spoke. It's good to have you back on the program. How's it going?
It's just fine, Ryan. Things are going well. How's your summer so far?
It's getting hot, as you can imagine here in Texas. It is getting rather warm. We had some plans to have some friends over a few weeks from now and come to the pool. And we were at the pool the other day, and we said, we're just going to go ahead and push that past Labor Day because it's sweltering, if you will.
Oh dear. Well, hopefully we'll also have a hot time on the podcast today.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, let's get into it. Let's get into a couple articles that you've put out for theAmericanEnergyNews.com, where, of course, you can find all of your stuff at. Oil sand players back Nolte's energy climate policies. And you say that it's sticky politics, potentially, for new conservative parties. So just before we kind of get into what all that means for our listeners that aren't Canadian, break down the political spectrum there just from how the parties work and just kind of how we might understand them in America, just so we can kind of understand where we're going before we go there.
Sure, happy to do that. The Democratic Party, the NDP, is historically Canada's Socialist Party. So that would be the party of the left of center. And it goes back on the prairies back to 1944. And it's formed a government in various prairie provinces and Ontario periodically since then, but never nationally. In Alberta, where the Alberta oil sands are located, that's the energy capital of Canada. From 1971 to 2015, the government party was the Progressive Conservatives, and it was a right of center party. And it basically got a little too fat and happy for its own good. And there was a lot of people were unhappy with it. And so the Alberta voters, who are the most conservative in Canada, voted out the Conservative Party and voted in the Socialist Party. And so that was quite a shock to everybody. And one of the things that's been interesting, though, and I don't spend a lot of time writing about fiscal policy or taxation or education, things like that. I concentrate on energy. On the energy side, the government has taken a very centrist approach to energy. And so it's been supportive of pipelines for the industry, primarily out to the West Coast, which is going to be very contentious this fall. We'll have to do a podcast on that because many of your listeners will have followed the Dakota Access Standing Rock controversy earlier in this year. And it's the protests over the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline that Kinder Morgan wants to build to the West Coast is going to be far more contentious than that. There's going to be violence. It's going to be nasty. So the socialist premier has supported the industry and pipeline on that. And where the divergence comes, and a little bit of a bit of irony here, is that the conservative parties in Alberta have been very critical of the Socialist Party, the NDP, over a little bit of extra taxation and some other, but the climate policies are the real thing. And so the NDP Premier, Rachel Notley, put in place three-pronged approach for the oil sands. And the oil sands, for your listeners who aren't familiar with, refer to oil that is trapped in clay and sand. And it's almost like peanut butter. It's called bitumen. And it has to be either mined and refined that way into something that can be put in a pipeline, or it gets produced with a process called steam-assisted gravity drainage. So, and how that works is the oil company will drill two horizontal wells side by side. They're separated by only a few yards. And into the top one, they pump steam, and the steam loosens up and dilutes the bitumen, which then drips down and can be produced by the well below it. And so that's how they turn this peanut butter consistency bitumen into oil. And the problem is that it takes a lot of natural gas, a lot of extra energy to produce oil that way. And that means that the greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands industry is very, very high. In fact, it's about 10% of all Canadian emissions. And with Canada signing on to the Paris Climate Accord and the commitment to reduce emissions quite significantly, that meant that the oil sands had to do something. And the big producers, just like the producers in the U.S., the big ones, have been calculating in a carbon price to their budget for a very long time. And so they were quite supportive of greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so they worked with the socialist government. If you can imagine big oil and the socialists working closely together. And they came up with a set of regulations that industry likes, government likes, and will get emissions down from a very high level down to the same level as the average U.S. Crude oil, which is quite a technical feat. And the problem, of course, is for the conservative parties, because they champion the oil industry's cause. Now, what do? The Socialist Party has policies that the industry likes, and it's pretty hard to criticize them. So the Conservative Party has to go tread lightly, and that was the subject of one of my columns. Was how are they going to navigate that sticky patch of politics when part of the oil industry, the biggest part by far, is supportive of the Socialist Party.
Now, you mentioned the big oil is partnering up with the government there, and that is kind of a unique thing. So how is that working? How are those talks going? Is it big oil kind of conceding, or is it big oil trying to maybe just put out a front and saying, hey, this is where we're at, and we're really going after this thing? What is your take on big oil and how they are approaching the Socialist Party?
Big oil is an enthusiastic participant in that policy. It's something that they helped design the policy, and they are squarely behind it. One of the reasons for that is they believe that going forward in a sort of post-Paris climate deal world, countries are going to increasingly adopt a carbon tax or some other way to encourage companies and consumers to get greenhouse gas emissions down. And that's a carbon-constrained world. And because their emissions are so high, if they can get the emissions down to the same as an ordinary crude, they think that gives them a competitive advantage. But on top of all of that, there was a study a couple months ago by the Canadian Energy Research Institute, which showed if they moved to different technologies and stopped using natural gas and used a different mining technology, the new one is called the paraffinic froth treatment. Not only do they drop the carbon intensity of their crude oil, but they also wind up cutting their production costs by 34-40%. So it's kind of a virtuous, kind of a win-win for industry. Not only are they making the government happy and other governments where they might choose to export, but they're also cutting their costs because the oil sands, as you can imagine, are a high costs basin, and this helps their margins and helps them stay competitive into the future.
Right. Now, in the article, you point out that I think it's like 2.7 million barrels a day are coming from the oil sands, and it's supposed to get to about 4 million barrels a day by 2030. When do you expect these emissions reductions to actually take place, and you can actually see this 30 to 40% reduction that you're talking about?
I think it's expected fairly quickly. The companies have been developing and piloting a lot of this technology for quite a while. The Siri study that I referenced, for instance, says that there are 6 technology pathways, they call them, but what that basically means is different configurations of the new technologies. And 5 of them have already been piloted and are ready to go. So the companies have lots of choice in this, and they're already beginning to implement it. And what's called the in situ side, which has which uses the 2 horizontal wells to produce. Basically, what it comes down to is substituting solvent for steam. So it might be some kind of natural gas liquid, a lighter hydrocarbon that they use, and they inject that either along with the steam, a reduced amount of steam, of course, or they're getting to the point where they can inject it with no steam at all, and that helps them to instead of heating up the bitumen, it dissolves the bitumen, and then they can produce it that way. So, and on the mining side, there's a subsidiary of ExxonMobil called Imperial Oil that's been very innovative around new technologies in the oil sands. And a couple of years ago, Imperial opened a plant called Kearl, Kearl, and that plant produces crude oil, which is only 2% higher in carbon intensity than the average American crude. So the industry is making pretty good strides, and part of the policy platform that they're supportive of that was brought in by the Socialists is basically there's a carrot, there's a stick, and then there's a long list of penalties if no one does anything.
And so how the voters responded? Are they happy that this is kind of working out like they thought it would, or is this kind of a unexpected benefit of electing the Socialist Party?
Well, no, that's a very interesting question, Ryan, because no, the voters are not happy. And the voters aren't unhappy because of the regulations that the Socialist Party brought in on the oil sands side, but the NDP also applied a carbon tax on the consumer side. So basically everything that's has any emissions attached to it in the general economy gets taxed. And the way they designed the tax, 60% of consumers, the lower income, lower middle income and below, will get rebates. But that hasn't stopped the voters from being unhappy. And so according to public opinion polling, about 75% of them, depending on which poll you're looking at, are really upset about the carbon tax. And the Socialist Party is in big political trouble heading into, as we progress towards 2019, which is when the next provincial election will be held.
So let me just make sure I'm following along here. A conservative area votes in a Socialist Party. The Socialist Party works together with Big Oil to reduce carbon emissions, and the Big Oil's happy, the Socialists are happy, but the voters aren't happy because the Socialists ended up taxing them as well. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
That's exactly the situation that they've got themselves in. And the fear, there's a fellow I should mention here who deserves some praise, and his name is Dave Collier. And Dave came out of the Shell Canada. So he's an old Royal Dutch Shell man. He's an engineer. And in 2008, he went to head up the Canadian version of the American Petroleum Institute, which is called the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers. So it's Big Oil's, big lobby group. And he left that in 2015, and he was one of the key guys at the table when Big Oil negotiated these new regulations. And he says, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, that the oil sands policy is not a partisan issue. It is just flat out good public policy. It's good for the environment. It's good for the producers. Everybody's happy with it. So what worries me is the Conservative Party, because they're very clever, Conservative parties, sorry. They're very clever, and what they've been doing is exploiting the consumer unhappiness with the carbon tax, which is just exactly what you'd expect them to do. And they're talking about undoing all of that policy if they win the election in 2019. And just from a policy point of view, that I'm very opposed to that. It would be a big mistake and would not benefit the oil sands industry, which is the big creator of jobs and economic activity in Alberta, unless it was replaced with something that was as good or better. And the Conservative parties aren't tipping their hand yet as to what that might be.
And when you say that you're not in favor of the policy, let me just ask this.
Hang on a second. Let me clarify, Ryan. I am in favor of the policy, the oil sands, climate, those policies. It's changing them without knowing, either eliminating them, getting rid of them altogether. That's what I'm opposed to.
Yeah, I misspoke. Sorry. When you say you're not in favor of eliminating the policies, what I should have said. I guess my question is can you eliminate the consumer side but leave in the big oil side? Is that possible, or is the way the law written that it has to be both and type thing?
Well, as long as the NDP are in power, they're going to increase the carbon tax, not get rid of it. And so that will be probably the number one campaign issue in 2019 is what to do with carbon tax. And the Conservative parties have said that they would get rid of the carbon tax on the consumer side.
Well, one thing I'm curious about is, you talked about the Paris Climate Agreement and these companies that are wanting to look, maybe in other countries and they can say, hey, we've done it here in Canada, is that one thing we saw in the U.S. at least was companies coming out and saying, well, the U.S. backed out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but we're still going to operate as if those guidelines were still in place. And so could that ultimately happen to where maybe a Conservative Party gets back in, rolls back these regulations, but the companies go, you know what? We've already figured out a way to do it. We don't need to go back to the old way. And then it's a win-win, even though there's not regulation on the companies.
Yes, that could happen, but it's uncertain that it would happen. And one of the things that that oil companies like is certainty, right? You put in place a policy framework and then you stick to it, and you don't throw the producers any curveballs that they weren't expecting. So it's an unknown at this point in the game. And you brought up the issue of exporting this crude oil from the oil sands to other countries. There's an example actually within the U.S. where this applies. In California, where some of the oil sands crude does actually wind up, in California they have low carbon fuel regulations that are implemented at the refinery level. And so what they do is they've come out with a long list of all of the crude oils that are consumed in California, and they've created a carbon intensity index. So on that index, the average crude oil is about a 5 or a 10 in carbon intensity, but in the oil sands are a low 20s, maybe up to mid to high 30s, and that's pretty high. There are some that are a little higher. Nigerian brass crude is in the 80s, but for the most part, there aren't many crudes that have a higher carbon intensity than, say, 40. So what the refineries are required to do is the state sets a carbon intensity threshold. And the state will say, okay, I'm going to buy some light sweet crude from Texas. That has a carbon intensity of 5, but I want it. That's kind of more expensive oil. So I'm going to buy some heavy oil from Canada that has a carbon intensity of 32, and I'm going to blend them together so that I hit the state's threshold. And so what these regulations will do, if they're successful in bringing down the carbon intensity of the oil sands heavy crude, is now they're much more competitive in markets like California, because they would have the refinery can have the they can enjoy the benefit of a cheaper heavy crude, but now they don't have to worry about crossing that threshold and paying penalties to the state.
Okay, and we have on Markham Hislop, who comes on once a month for us, and from the AmericanEnergyNews.com. We're going to link to both the stories that we're talking about. We're kind of going back and forth. We've referenced the first one, and the second one is, of course, technology renaissance, transforming oil sands in the situ production, lowering cost and carbon intensity. One final question about these articles, and we'll link to them in the show notes so the listeners can go read them, is I see you have a profile of some quotes, rather, from both the CEOs of Suncor and of Cenovus, yes, Steve Williams and Brian Ferguson. So let me ask you this, just from a historical standpoint for the listeners, are these CEOs that if you would have said 5 years ago they're going to be willing to do this, you would have been shocked? Or is this kind of these two CEOs and these companies always been kind of progressive at tackling carbon emissions? Or is it more just the current climate has made them have to adapt to this?
I would say that both of those CEOs and both of those companies have been always been fairly progressive about emissions intensity and other aspects of their business. Now, I'll give you an example on the Suncor side. The CEO that founded that company, he became CEO in 1997, and of course his name conveniently escapes me. But Steve Williams' predecessor, we'll call him, they have a problem in northern Alberta where they operate with Indigenous peoples. So we call them First Nations, you folks call them Native Americans. And the First Nations were upset about these big oil sands operations on their reserves, on their traditional territories. They were worried about the environment. They were worried about they weren't getting any jobs for the young people. And so they were putting a lot of political pressure on the companies. And so Steve Williams' predecessor over at Suncor went in and he built relationships with these communities and did a really good job of resolving that conflict so that the company sort of earned social license, if you will, to operate in that area, kind of formed partnerships with the communities and with First Nation-led businesses. And as a result now, probably about 19 or 20% of all of the capital expenditures from Suncor are to First Nation-owned businesses. And they just reached a threshold the other day of 10% of employment within the company is Indigenous peoples. So they've been progressive. Both companies have been very progressive in other areas, and that same sort of culture has permeated the approach to greenhouse gas emission reduction.
Well, Markham, the AmericanEnergyNews.com is where people can find you under the Markham on Energy. It looks like you put out a blog almost daily, if I'm kind of looking through the past month here or so. And anywhere else or anything else that you'd like to plug or promote before we get you out of here today?
No, that's good. I hope everybody has a lovely summer, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next month.
Thanks again to Markham for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion. Look forward to having him on again next month. Question of the day. Be sure to email me your answer. We will read it on air at ryan@globalenergymedia.com. Do you think that the free market can tackle the issue of carbon emissions by itself, or do we need government regulation and oversight? Would love to hear your thoughts, ryan@globalenergymedia.com, and we will read your responses on the air. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.